It's lively in Crimea once again. Agents of the partisan movement Atesh have carried out a sabotage operation on the temporarily occupied peninsula. Details coming very soon. You're watching the Ukraine Today YouTube channel. This is the topic of the day. What else are we talking about? About the fact that the Pentagon has allegedly resumed providing some military aid to Ukraine. According to unofficial information, we are talking about ammunition, specifically 155mm artillery shells and GMLRS rockets for the HIMARS multiple launch rocket systems. Meanwhile, Kyiv has endured yet another combined enemy attack. They are dead and wounded. After this hellish night, Peskov stated that Russia prefers to achieve its goals through peaceful political and diplomatic means. Is it true that such attacks will now occur with terrifying regularity? More on this in the following report, and then we'll return to the studio for discussion.
Glory to Ukraine.
The partisan movement Atesh continues to destroy Russian logistics in temporarily occupied Crimea. This time, a relay cabinet was destroyed on an important section of the railway passing through the Kerch Bridge. This stretch of track is strategic for the occupying forces, as equipment, fuel and personnel are regularly transported through it. The strike on this logistical lifeline delayed important deliveries of military cargo, and according to Atesh, there will be more and more such strikes. Meanwhile, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Alexander Syrsky, emphasized the restoration of positions and the holding of territories in the Kursk and Belgorod regions to tie down the enemy at the border with Ukraine.
The actions of Ukraine's defense forces in the Kursk and Belgorod regions are tying down the operational reserves of the occupying army, preventing the general staff of the occupier's army from redeploying operational reserves directly to the territory of the Sumy and accordingly Kharkiv regions to expand their zone of presence and create the so-called buffer zone. And this has not only military, but also accordingly political and informational consequences for the occupying country.
At the moment, the Russian army is unable to carry out the political decision of its military leadership, namely the creation of buffer zones in the territory of the Sumy and Kharkiv regions.
And accordingly, the active nature of hostilities in the territory of the Kursk and Belgorod regions makes it possible to divert significant reserves of the occupying forces from accomplishing this task.
Without having liberated their own territory, the occupiers are climbing into someone else's. Mostly, though, it's just informational. They claim they've already captured everything and defeated everyone. For example, that's exactly what they're doing now with the Dnipropetrovsk region.
There is no objective control data indicating any tactical successes by the occupiers in terms of capturing territories in the Dnipropetrovsk region. At the same time, the occupiers are trying to intensify pressure on the positions of Ukraine's defense forces in several directions at once, precisely with the aim of reaching the administrative borders of the Dnipropetrovsk region. First and foremost, this refers to the Novopolok and Pokrovsky directions.
Meanwhile, in Kyiv, the Security Service of Ukraine, SBU, detained Chinese spies who were gathering secret technologies related to the production of Ukrainian missiles. A father and son, citizens of the People's Republic of China, attempted to illegally export to China secret documentation on the Ukrainian missile system RK-360 megacoulombs Neptune, which sent the famous cruiser Moskva to the bottom. Those detained on suspicion of espionage face up to 15 years in prison with confiscation of property. The army of the aggressor state Russia is increasing the number of UAVs it uses during massive attacks on Ukraine. And among these drones, there are decoys and imitators.
First and foremost, we are talking about the Iranian-made Geron drones. Their primary and most significant task is to effectively drain the valuable resources of Ukraine's air defense systems, forcing them to expend precious ammunition and time. For context, out of the 750 aeroballistic munitions that were launched during the most massive recent attack on Kyiv, about 400 were Geron drones. In other words, what is created is a so-called wave-like pattern of attack. This is the actual experience of the Ukrainian side, a so-called swarm attack.
The Air Force of the Armed Forces of Ukraine has already learned to distinguish between real drones and decoys, relying on radar-specific flight parameters, as well as visual and acoustic characteristics.
Next, we'll be speaking with Serhiy Bratchuk, spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army. Serhiy, hello, it's good to see you.
Glory to Ukraine. Glory to Ukraine. Greetings.
Glory to the heroes. Serhiy, let's start with temporarily occupied Crimea. What are we seeing there today? Sabotage activity, right? The railway has been damaged, temporarily put out of commission, let's hope. So, yesterday there were strikes in the temporarily occupied Crimea. How would you describe the situation in Crimea as of today, in July 2025? How far or close are we to liberating Crimea? Because we can already see that the occupation authorities are starting to get nervous.
Well, I can say for sure that every day, in any case, we are getting closer those structures, those forces that are working on the liberation of Crimea. Every day they are bringing our territory closer to that good day when we can all say that the Russian occupier no longer treads on the land of the Ukrainian peninsula. And every day, I'm not going to say that we're making giant leaps or that we're fulfilling a 5-year plan. That's not our approach, as they say. But you can see for yourself that every day, every single day, something is happening in Crimea. We're talking about relay cabinets catching fire, about combat mosquitoes flying in to hit various targets. Then, after a certain number of days of explosions, reports start to appear, for example, from the main intelligence directorate or the security service of Ukraine listing a whole range of destroyed military facilities, weapons and equipment. We're talking about, among other things, air defense systems, which is very important, as well as combat aircraft and damaged infrastructure. In other words, essentially today in Crimea, which was intended, and unfortunately the enemy managed to do this, to turn Crimea into a large military hub. Something happens every day, and there are gradually fewer such facilities and weapons left in Crimea. Yes, we would like things to move faster. Yes, probably we would like it to be on a larger scale, but we fully understand the difficulties those that our defense forces face, the certain challenges involved in liberating Crimea. Today we are still going through a very important and probably fundamental stage of the demilitarization of Crimea, when, for example, in order to use other means to strike it well, in particular, probably our aircraft, just to get a bit ahead of myself. That's why Russian air defense facilities are being destroyed on the territory of our Crimea, and not only air defense. In particular, this also includes the resource base, which concerns, among other things, ammunition, fuel, and lubricants, in short, everything that supports the war effort. So all this work is ongoing. Once again, I'll say, of course, we'd like things to move faster, that's obvious, but the work being done is very, very important. It's not rushed, it's carefully calculated, yes, so that every strike delivers results.
All right. At the same time, Syrskyi says that we are actively operating on the territory of the Russian Federation and strengthening our positions in the Kursk and Belgorod regions. And what's happening there? How do you see the situation? And, well, what is ultimately the goal of the armed forces of Ukraine?
Absolutely right. By the way, this was mentioned and emphasized in the report. It may have been brief, but a very important point is that in the North Slobodansky direction until recently, this was still the Sumy sector of the front. The enemy received an order from the deranged Führer in the Kremlin to create a buffer sanitary zone on the territory of our Ukrainian Sumy region. And so, naturally, what else could the Russian troops do? They rushed to carry out this order. They charged forward, shouting hurrah, hoping for a blitzkrieg. And here in your studio, on your channel, we specifically talked about the fact that, first of all, the blitzkrieg didn't work out. That's obvious. Secondly, we see that the Ukrainian defense forces managed to stop the enemy. They succeeded in using tactical maneuvers, such as counterattacks. And now their success isn't measured only, for example, by liberating certain settlements or pushing the enemy back to the Russian-Ukrainian border. It is also measured by the fact that the enemy is truly pinned down there. At present, the enemy is trying to continue pursuing its combat objectives, but they are running into the defenses of our forces, our units, and let's say even tactical level successes are not being observed among the Russians today. And at the same time, as we've discussed before, most likely this moment will play a positive role for us. I'm not saying that everything is over in Sumy region, that the fires have been put out and we can close the curtain. No, there is still a lot of combat work to be done, and everything there is very complicated. In any case, the Russians are trying to attack, and our defense forces have a lot of work to do. Nevertheless, some basic points have already been secured by us today. So, in fact, we are talking about Kursk region, Belgorod region, these counter movements. When our troops operate on the territory of the Russian Federation, they are supposed to yield results. And here too, it's not about the territories. Obviously, it's one thing when we control thousands of square meters in the Kursk region, and it served as a buffer zone. Today, of course, it's become dozens of times smaller, and now it's the commanding heights along the border. But what is the result? The result is indeed that we have managed and continue to manage to hold back those reserves that quite possibly could have ended up, say, on the Pokrovsk direction or the Zaporizhia direction as recently as yesterday. It's clear that the enemy is already losing momentum. Today, the enemy is no longer keeping to the schedules that they obviously had during this offensive campaign, or rather this latest offensive wave, which probably began not even in the summer, but at the end of April this year. Accordingly, these positions are tactically returning to us. I won't talk right now about the possible encirclement there, the operational tactical encirclement of some Russian units, including elite ones. The airborne forces are fighting there, just like in Sumy region, as well as the Marines. Right now, let's focus on what remains the most important. We are managing to hold back the Russian troops, tie them down, and through combat operations and tactical maneuvers, force the enemy to move in this direction. I'm not saying we should forget the Sumy region, but they still have plenty of problems in the Kursk region today.
Regarding the Sumy region and in general, this much hyped, supposedly massive and successful Russian summer offensive promoted by their information operations, right? Look, here the opinions of experts, as they say, are divided because some analysts and leading Western publications see that this offensive is losing steam. But at the same time, several reputable Western publications are publishing material stating that Putin is confident that success is inevitable and that this offensive is already bearing fruit. So where is the truth, in your view?
Well, in fact, the fact that Putin is confident in what is happening and that he is winning is obvious at this point. But as for the real situation, well, it's hard for me to make a diagnosis here, although in my opinion, it's obvious. As for this large summer offensive, a huge part of it is the informational component. We can see this along the entire front line. But there is also, in my view, a very important point here. The fact is that we very often, and I say this unfortunately, but nevertheless, we can track the successes or failures of the Russians by the terrorist strikes that the Russian Federation carries out on our peaceful or relatively peaceful cities and towns. We understand perfectly well. Today, the entire territory of Ukraine is at war. The whole territory of our country is under the threat of potential missile strikes or kamikaze drone attacks. Accordingly, the terror from the Russian side is increasing. The enemy is using more combined strikes, deploying more kamikaze drones, although among them, indeed, at least about half are decoys accordingly. But in addition to missiles, again, today I wouldn't say that the enemy is particularly trying to save them. But on the other hand, we remember how many missiles could be launched across our territory within just a few hours. Let's recall the years 2022 and 2023. Yes, the tactics have changed a bit today, and the weaponry has changed as well. Now, these are drone and missile strikes, but this is terror that is, of course, aimed at constantly instilling a sense of fear and insecurity about their safety in our people. And actually, I probably wouldn't say just yet it's still a bit too early to call this Russia's agony. No, this is Russian malice stemming from the fact that even during the war, our people somehow managed to live better than those in the Russian hinterland. I don't know how we Ukrainians managed to do this, but nevertheless we do. And another thing, the most important, on the battlefield, the Russians aren't having any major successes today. There are some locations on the front, I won't name them right now, where, let's say, the situation is rather critical for some of our units. But again, we see and understand this perfectly well. And even more so, our command, which operates in this theater of military operations, receives this information firsthand and knows it much better than any expert in this studio or elsewhere. That's why there's this malice, this desire to bomb, to kill those people who could live, and will live better than people in the Russian hinterland. The desire to destroy everything. In other words, this so-called Russian war that we're talking about. But what's important here is something else. When we talk about the bombings that the enemy carries out on our cities and villages almost every night, what's important is that we manage to protect our settlements with new types of weaponry. Well, let's put it this way, with new elements of air defense. And today, whoever says that mobile fire groups have supposedly outlived their usefulness is wrong. Right now, if we take all these elements we have, add interceptor drones, scale up these processes, include light aviation, and put it all together, then of course we will still be better protected than we are today. There's a lot of work to do, but we are obligated to get it done.
Wow, and the resumption of military aid from the United States gives us hope, as does today's announcement from the UK about thousands and thousands of shells for the defense of Ukraine's skies. How will this change things in the near future, specifically the resumption of American arms deliveries to the front as of today? How might this affect the situation based on the types of equipment currently being mentioned by the Western press, for example?
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Well, in fact, no one really knows the exact quantities of what has been sent, received and used in battle, except for those who are sending, receiving and using it. Thank God, that's absolutely the right decision. We certainly won't be talking about that. But in any case, I remember how the enemy was already singing funeral song for our HIMARS, saying there were no more shells. That was it, the HIMARS were finished. But the HIMARS are not finished. And in fact, you can see that ammunition for them is coming back. Why have we probably started hearing so little about our HIMARS? It's not because they've disappeared from the battlefield, but because we've gotten so used to this excellent weapon that it no longer causes any kind of excitement, at least not emotionally. Although we should celebrate every success and applaud our defense forces. Accordingly, for the enemy today, let's say the information space is saturated with negative assessments of what is happening, such as the resumption of various types of weapon supplies to Ukraine. In fact, you can see that air defense systems are being discussed as well. And that's only what we know has been made public in the open domain. We perfectly and completely understand that behind the intricate curtain of this complex military political picture, there are many secret and hidden things that do not happen openly or transparently. And thank God, I'll say it again, but this is what will have an impact, will influence the battlefield.
Sergei, well, judging by the fact that the Russian propaganda machine was given the command to attack Trump, we can imagine, yes, what might be happening in that shadowy part that we don't know about yet. And probably the wisest decision was made by Merkel, the new Chancellor of Germany, who classified all military supplies, rightly saying that in general, this is not the time. Let the Russian Federation be surprised on the battlefield by what it encounters there. Thank you so much for finding the time, despite your service in the armed forces of Ukraine. Thank you for protecting all of us. And despite your service, you still find time to regularly meet with us and clarify many important points. We were joined by Serhiy Brachuk, spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army. See you next time, Serhiy.